It's a big part of the book is trying to help parents who don't get why their kids are so into gaming understand it. There's a lot of parents that just don't understand gaming at all, so that's a big part of it too. Let's understand it, let's unpack it, let's see what's good and true and beautiful in it. Let's also unpack what can be broken in it too.
Welcome to the Nerds of Prey, where we're bridging the gap between faith and fandom by introducing you to the leading folks on the front lines of nerd ministry. These are the people I've met as I plan a church for nerds, geeks, and gamers. I found them, so you don't have to. Welcome, folks. I am Nerd Pastor Nate. This is a Checkpoint Church podcast that drops once a month on our podcast Friday. Each episode of the podcast will feature someone at the intersection of faith and fandom, and we'll then sit down with them and learn more about their story. How did they first discover that God is in pop culture, and where do they see things going from here? Our guest for today is a real treat. We're going to be hearing from Drew Dixon, formerly of Love Thy Nerd, and the current book, Know Thy Gamer. In this pod, we're going to get into a little bit about Love Thy Nerd, how it got started, and then also how this book, Know Thy Gamer, can be a great source for parents of gamers or just for people wanting to talk about games in an interesting way with youth. A quick caveat, this episode was recorded quite a while ago, so some of the information is a bit outdated. Keep in mind, this was mid-2021 when we recorded this, and it may not make sense in the current timeline. Specifically, Drew has since stepped back from some of his obligations at Love Thy Nerd, with their current leadership being able to be found at lovethynerd.com/about. With that, let's get into the show. Here is our latest Nerd of Prey, Drew Dixon of Know Thy Gamer and Love Thy Nerd. Enjoy. Drew, thank you so much for being on the podcast today. Thanks for being on the Nerds of Prey. We're excited to learn more about the exciting things that Love Thy Nerd is doing and your role there, but also just in your own nerdy ministry and writing that you're doing outside of that world. So to get us started and just to help people know who you are and where you're from, let's just ask that. So who are you first and foremost, and where are you currently, both physically and on social media? What does your social media presence look like?
Yeah, sure. So I am the chief content nerd at Love Thy Nerd, which means I oversee all of our written content, amongst a lot of other things. So I wear a lot of, as everyone who helped found Love Thy Nerd, I'm one of the 6 founders of our ministry. We wear a lot of different hats. So I also host a podcast, one of our podcasts where we interview game designers and people in the games industry about their spiritual beliefs and their life and what they're about. It's called Humans of Gaming. I'm also a editor and publisher. So I work for a publishing company in Nashville, a Lifeway Christian Resources, where I'm mostly work in student ministry curriculum. So my team, I oversee a few different teams that produce student ministry curriculum for local churches. So I definitely have a heart for the church as well. And that's my background. Actually, I was a pastor for about 6 years before coming to Nashville, where I live now. And I wrote a book that's coming out in the summer. So that's another really exciting thing in my life. It's being published by B&H Publishing, and it'll be out in the summer of 2022. And it's called Know Thy Gamer, A Parent's Guide to Video Games. So it is a Christian parenting book on navigating video games with your kids. There's all these parents that are pulling their hair out because they hate how much their kids love video games. And so this is a book that tries to help parents learn to love and respect their gamer kids and understand them and understand the world they're in, because it feels foreign to a lot of parents. Even though more parents are technically savvy now than they used to be, technologically savvy than they used to be, there's still that divide. And so I want to try to bridge that gap and help parents love their kids and set appropriate boundaries and love them, those kinds of things. But also help them develop a vocabulary to see why games matter and why they can be good for us, which is a big part of like that issue of what I do with Love Thy Nerd. One of my passions is to help. What we do at Love Thy Nerd is we want to be the love of Jesus to nerds and nerd culture. So a big part of that is like understanding nerd culture, understanding what nerds are about, what makes them click, seeing what's good, beautiful, and true in nerd culture, and celebrating those things, and then also helping the church see the opportunity that there is in nerd culture to love and serve their nerdy neighbors and point them to Jesus.
The first thing that I want to address is, who are you as a nerd, and where do you find yourself in this space? So most of the answers have been that we're all nerdy melting pots. But if you had to come up with the true essence of your nerddom, what flavor of nerd would you consider yourself?
Oh man, I guess I definitely grinded my teeth as a nerd playing video games. That was my first love as a kid. And still to this day, I love to play video games. Unfortunately, like with 3 kids, I play them. I just wrote a book about video games, but I feel like I don't have time to play them anymore like I would want to, but I still love it. So yeah, I'm a video gamer, but I also, if I could all day, I would play board games all day for sure. Like now those are probably equal loves, video games and board games. I dabble in anime, dabble in comics, just dabble lightly. I dabble in all kinds of nerd stuff, but video games and board games, that's me.
Yeah.
How
So
about you?
video games and board games. I'm more of an anime fan than anything. I'm definitely
Okay.
the weebiest of the nerd ministers. I attended LTNCon last year, and that
Yeah.
was the place that I gravitated toward, was the Jesus
Okay.
Otaku and
What's
that,
like
that
your
group in particular.
what's one or two animes that are like your jam? I'm just curious now.
Oh, man.
Now I'm interviewing you. Is that okay?
That's all good. That's all good. I got plenty of them. I feel like the one that really sums it all up is always Full Metal Alchemist. That's like the hallmark of anime for me.
Yeah.
But currently I've been getting into a little bit different genre. Right now I'm actually not an anime at all. I'm in horror shows just because it's spooky season. Halloween as we're recording
Yeah.
this.
Nice.
But there's tons of great ones out there. Let's see. Puella Magi Madoka is something that I've really enjoyed, especially because that's kind of a spooky one as well that kind of lets itself off as a magical girl trope, kind of like Sailor Moon, and then very quickly takes a twist towards the very dark. So, yeah, pretty much anything and everything anime, I try and pick it all up as it comes out. But I do find myself going more and more towards the like darker and more demented death game stuff like Danganronpa and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Something about my pastoral energy, I guess I'm trying to flee away from that and experience the darker side of life. But yeah, that's more my steez is going in that anime world.
Cool. Yeah.
So you say you started out with video games,
Yep.
and board games and that kind of thing has always been your passion. So where did that begin? Was it just playing by yourself on the couch down in the basement with whatever console of the generation might have been, or did you have like a particular line of Nintendo or Sony or Xbox or whatever might have you with the video game journey?
I got started, or my parents bought us. Well, I say us. Actually, they bought it for themselves. My mom bought a Nintendo, the original NES, for her and my dad to play games on. And they played it for a week. And then my brother and I took it over. It was like, became our Nintendo. So we would go to, this shows how old I am. We'd go to like Blockbuster and rent NES games. We'd ride our bikes and stuff to Blockbuster and rent NES games. And then eventually we got a Super Nintendo. I think maybe the first game I remember falling in love with was probably like Final Fantasy 2 on the SNES. And that was like going in deep and like really getting into a video game. So yeah, then in high school, by the time I was in high school, I had a Nintendo 64 and a PlayStation. And I remember, it's a funny story. I remember my mom said I couldn't get a PlayStation because I already had a Nintendo 64. And so she's, you already have a game, one of those game things. Like, you can't buy a PlayStation. But I was like mowing lawns and stuff. So I had saved up all this money. So I had the money to go get it. So I rode my bike to the mall, which was like a long bike ride from where we lived. I rode my bike to the mall and went to the EB game store there and bought a PlayStation, put it in a backpack, and rode my bike back home. And that's how I got a PlayStation.
Yeah, that's awesome. The things we do for love, right? We gotta go.
The funny thing is, too, my mom never knew that I did that. Never, because she would just look at my room, and by that time, I think I had this little like 19-inch TV in my room that they didn't need anymore. They'd replaced their TV, and I inherited it. And they were like, "Oh, there's Drew playing this game thing." They didn't know the difference between a PlayStation and a Nintendo 64.
Yeah, that's true. Especially with, I know a lot of like parents and people that aren't just in the video game sphere will just call them, "You're playing a Nintendo," and they'll just call everything a Nintendo.
Yep.
So every video game
Exactly.
system is Nintendo.
Yeah.
So you could just say, "Yeah, playing the Nintendo." Absolutely, Mom. Definitely doing that.
Yeah. And then when I was in college, and all through that time, I was really into like Final Fantasy games. But by the time I was in college, I had a Xbox, and we were doing Halo tournaments, LAN parties. I dabbled in PC gaming throughout my life too. For a while, I was really into Warcraft 2 and StarCraft and stuff, and played that on dial-up, if you can believe. We would play Warcraft 2 on dial-up, and my parents would get really mad because we'd tie up the phone lines.
See, I'm fortunate that in the dial-up days in my household, where like I was young, and so those were like my pajama Sam and those kind of days. So not many internet-based games for 5-year-olds, thankfully.
Yeah.
So I didn't tie up anything there, but yeah, you have this nerd journey. You have this thing that's just been in your life since childhood. What about the faith journey as far as those two might have intersected? Were you always a Christian, grew up in a Christian household, and then discovered that they intersected, or were they always two divided things? I grew up in a pastor's house, and so we had my like nerd friends over here and my youth group friends over here, and never the two shall meet. So how did that look like, and when did that intersection occur?
Yeah. So I was definitely a nerd before I was a Christian. I did grow up in a Christian home, but we weren't like my parents didn't talk to me about Jesus or about our faith. We went to church, but we weren't like super committed churchgoers would be how I would describe it. We were pretty sporadic in our attendance. And so I didn't even, I guess if you would have asked me, I would have said I was a Christian, but I didn't think about it very much.
Yeah.
It wasn't a big part of my life. So when I was in high school, I started dating this girl who was pretty serious about her faith, and she thought I was a Christian, and I probably did too. But then I ended up, that's where I really met Jesus, at her church, because like it's not, like the church that she went to is not the kind of church I would want to go to now. But I do appreciate some things about it, I guess, just in that every Wednesday night they'd have an invitation at the youth group meeting. Right. And every Sunday morning there was an invitation. So I don't really like vibe with that now, but that sort of high pressure approach. But it was good for me at the time because it sort of made me go, I really need to think about if I believe this stuff. Like, I've gone to church all these years. Do I really think Jesus rose from the dead, died on the cross, and that has something to do with me finding forgiveness and a relationship with God? And so that was the catalyst to make me like get really serious and think about that. And that was the first time I started reading the Bible and for myself, and maybe even just reading the Bible ever. I don't remember paying attention. I remember going to church when I was a kid and just like trying to sleep through it if I could.
Doodling on the back of the little,
Yeah.
tithe cards or whatever.
Yeah. My mom would get mad at me when I hit my head on the pew in front of me because I started dozing off. But yeah, it's funny, like that church, I definitely, there's a lot of things I appreciate about it. I remember that was the first time I remember being shamed for being a nerd. And it wasn't even something I was into at the time, but like probably like later high school, early college years, I was still at that church. And I remember there was this discussion and people were like slamming Harry Potter. And I wasn't even reading Harry Potter at the time. Now I've read all the books, love them. But I was just like, they were like slamming it. Oh, it's so terrible. And I was like, wait, what? What's wrong with Harry Potter? It's just like a fun wizard story.
Right.
And they were like, oh, it's demonic and stuff. And I was just like, okay, that's weird. And that was about the extent of it. Oh, and I remember this is also weird too. We had a prophecy conference.
Oh.
I put prophecy in air quotes because I'm not sure this really counts as true prophecy.
Sure.
But like I went to this prophecy conference. I was like, this is my church. Go check it out. So I went. And this guy had all these slides about all these toys and things and how they had demons in them and like on their iconography and graphics and stuff. And I definitely remember Pokemon was one that he mentioned. A lot of these Pokemons are like tied to various demons. And I didn't necessarily think they were crazy or anything. And I didn't feel super ashamed because a lot of stuff they mentioned I wasn't into. I just thought, this is weird. I don't really think that's true. Yeah. I just had this like red flag in my mind go up like, I don't think that's quite right. But those things I think trained me to not necessarily be super open about the things I was nerdy about. I think that was my experience. And so then when I went to seminary, especially, like I just decided, because I'd heard and a lot of the time what I was hearing was like, hey, really video games probably are just like the biggest problem with them is they're wasting your time and not helping you be a better follower of Jesus. And so I put them on pause and didn't play video games most of seminary. So it wasn't until I got to be a pastor, help plant a church after I graduated seminary. And this church that I planted was in a bit of a rural area. And I was just like, I just needed like some kind of creative outlet. So I got back into playing video games a little bit, but actually for the purpose of writing about them. I wanted to explore them from a Christian perspective because at that time, there weren't Christians that were writing about video games, except to say, hey, you shouldn't do this, or here's all the things that are bad about X, Y, or Z game. Like you could find Christian articles about Grand Theft Auto and why it's terrible, or any other number of games, but you didn't see any Christians going, let's explore the themes in Fallout 3 and how they relate to a Christian worldview there wasn't any effort to see any good in games. And I thought, I was seeing some good. I've always seen some good in games. So I think I had a desire to try to correct the narrative a bit.
Yeah. So as you're exploring these and as you're writing on these pieces, that's where you discovered it was just in an effort to make the connection. You you were the catalyst making the connection. You were the one tying these things together.
Yeah. And should say I had a friend who was an editor of who started a website called Christ and Pop Culture. And we had started writing together a bit. And he asked me to come be an editor for that website. And he was a gamer and a nerd. And I think that he was doing really unique work in the space of pop culture, like taking it seriously from a confessionally Christian perspective, and I was like, oh, that's like that kind of made me go, oh, okay, you can be a nerd and a Christian, and this is viable. And I think that was like all the encouragement I need. And I think sometimes that's all nerds need to like step into these kind of spaces, ministry spaces. Christian nerds need is just, hey, you're not alone. There's other people doing this stuff, and it's not lesser ministry or something. In fact, it's really innovative, I think, and really has a lot of tremendous amount of potential.
Yeah, just realizing that it's possible is a huge proponent of what we're doing here at Checkpoint. Whenever I first got started, Love Thy Nerd was one of the first people that I reached out to. One of the first entities that I saw how this is working and how nerd ministry is being done and being done well. And there's more and more examples as I continue to deep dive and to do more research. So I'd love to talk more about Love Thy Nerd. You already mentioned a little bit about your role, that you're the chief content nerd. You oversee a lot of the writing and the content creation there. So how did that first start out? I know you also mentioned you were one of the founders. So how did you first get involved with Love Thy Nerd in whatever form or fashion there?
Yeah, while I was pastoring in Alabama in this rural church, which like I never would have thought I would end up in Alabama, but I loved the church I was at. It was a wonderful church, but I still, like I said, I needed a creative outlet. So I started writing really seriously about games, and that spawned into not just writing for Christ Pop Culture, but also I wrote for Relevant Magazine and Paste Magazine and Christianity Today and Think Christian and all sorts of, I was into it, and it was like enjoying some success, I think. I stumbled, as an editor for Christ Pop Culture, I stumbled onto this ministry called Game Church, and I'd heard rumors about them that they passed out these Jesus Bible, or gamer Bibles is what they would call them. They passed out these gamer Bibles at like conventions like E3. I even heard a rumor that they had given out beer at E3. So I was like, this is crazy. What is this ministry? So I interviewed the guy who started Game Church about Game Church, which was this ministry that would go to conventions, mostly video game conventions all over the country, and pass out these little, like they call them gamer Bibles. It was just the Gospel of John with some gamer commentary in it, like game lingo commentary, and it had Jesus they had this giant banner at these conventions that had this huge Victorian style Jesus with an Xbox headset and controller. So they called him Gamer Jesus. And people would come and take pictures with Gamer Jesus and stuff. So I interviewed their founder, and he stumbles onto some of the stuff I had written, and he was like, the writing world, like you know how to write about video games and stuff. And he's like, we have this blog, and we don't know what to do with it. Would you consider taking over our blog and like joining our team and help us figure out what we're doing? And I was like, sure. It's kind of like I stumbled onto some people who were into what I was doing. It was another one of those moments where I realized I wasn't alone. Like, here's these people doing really unique work, and what they had done, just to explain the beer thing, because that's
out
probably
in the air now.
yeah. They had passed out like free beer coupons is what it was. And it was just, I know some people have a problem with that, and I get it, but the point of that was just to like, they wanted to shock you in a way to get your attention. Hey, we're not, and it was like, of course you had to show your ID, and you had to go, and you just got one little cup of beer. And anyway, it was wild. Game Church was wild in some ways, but nobody was doing that. No one was doing that kind of ministry at that time. So I thought, hey, I'll see if I can help them for a while. And that ended up turning into I worked for them for about almost 6 years doing that. Got to go to conventions all over the country. Me and a team of other editors and writers really turned that website into something that was respected, not just by Christians, but by non-Christians. So there were a lot of non-Christian outlets that would quote our articles, or like all kinds of like secular game journalists that were following us. It was really cool. And that's where we had the idea to start interviewing game designers in a podcast about their spiritual beliefs. Like we interviewed Ken Levine one time, who's the creator of BioShock and BioShock Infinite, and also an atheist. It was cool. I think God was at work in those efforts. And anyway, so fast forward, and Game Church went through some big organizational changes, some big budgetary changes, and all those kinds of things. And so myself and some other people that were working for Game Church found ourselves not seeing a future with it anymore. It wasn't going in the direction we were going anymore. And so we got to this place where we felt like we had to part ways. Like that was, and I love that ministry is still around. It's very different. It's very different now than it used to be, but it's still around. And I love the people who are leading it. They're amazing Christ following people. And I'm thankful for them. But we got to this point where we had to part ways, and started praying, saying, because I still had this drive to do nerd ministry. And so we had the idea, I think, as we prayed and thought about what might be next, we had the idea of broadening out, not just reaching nerds, not just reaching gamers, video gamers, but reaching nerds. And so that was where Love Thy Nerd was born. And yeah, that's the long story short. There's 6 of us that were all working in various Most of us part-time, a couple of them full-time capacities for Game Church, broke out and went and started our own 501c3 nonprofit ministry that is Love Thy Nerd. We've been going for almost 4 years, I guess.
Yeah, that's interesting. Just thinking about the growth and the changes and the evolutions that's already happened in this nerdy space. We had Derek White on not too long ago, who is the geek preacher.
Yeah, I know Derek.
Was very much involved in the kind of Christian Gamer Guild, D&D kind of world. And even hearing him talk about the evolution that took place and seeing all these different ways that things have changed and grown, adapted, and yeah, it's just incredible to me looking from the outside, being the fresh meat on campus and getting to see where the world has already gone and just being humbled by the reality of the internet. And we're all going to reach so many people just because of the expanse of there is no shortage of people to reach in this space. It's not like we're all
That's right.
in the same small town, rural USA. We're reaching the entire internet, which there's plenty of space for it. So I want to talk more about your title as far as the chief content nerd of Love Thy Nerd and the way it works into your other passions. Like you mentioned, the Game Church person seeing in you, you have a real passion for writing and I just really see a calling in that. And so what is this title as the chief content nerd? What does that actually mean to you as a ministry? Like, how do you see that working? And it seems like that is the place that you keep coming back to, no matter how you serve.
Sure.
That's what you do. So why that? What does that mean to you?
Yeah, I think for me, it probably starts at feeling like that's area God has gifted me. So for a while now, that's what I do professionally now too. I'm an editor essentially and work in publishing. I love words. I love the power of words. I love to dig deep into things deeper. Most of us go into all kinds of things in nerd culture. I also love helping people understand why. I don't know if you've ever done Strengths Finder. Have you ever done that? You know what that is? Yeah. So ideation is one of mine, and I love brainstorming, and I love thinking about how can we help people see things that they didn't see before. And I think that's what I also love to teach the Bible. I do miss being a pastor in many ways, and the biggest part I miss is like just regularly getting to teach. And so all those things together, I think that's one of my hopes. And I think we've done some really cool stuff in that space with Love Thy Nerd is we want to educate the church to see this mission field that they're missing. And we want to help them see that Dungeons and Dragons, which the church has just constantly labeled Dungeons and Dragons as dangerous or demonic, but to see that, man, there's some really cool ministries right now going on in that space. Some people doing some amazing things in the D&D space, and the church is still thumbing their nose about it. So we did a series of articles on that Jacqueline Parrish wrote about how does Dungeons and Dragons relate to a Christian worldview. And then there was another seminary professor. Jacqueline's not a seminary professor, but she's a PhD student. But then there's another seminary professor named Philip Talon who wrote A Christian Defense of Dungeons and Dragons. And I just love the idea of opening people's eyes. And we wrote these series on different genres of nerd culture, like why do board games matter? Why do video games matter? Why does anime matter? Those kinds of things. Why do comics matter? And just helping people see the opportunity in those spaces is huge for us. But then also just like digging deep into things. So like we're doing a series on Star Wars Visions right now. There's a reflective article on each episode that comes out. We did one of those on Loki and WandaVision. So yeah, I hope we're training Christians to be more thoughtful, but then also we're introducing, I think one of the goals of our website constantly is like, hey, I tell our writers all the time, don't write like you're just writing to your Christian buddies or the people in your church, to your atheist friend, right? Yes, you're going to talk about Jesus and all that kind of stuff. We want people talking about, we don't hide Jesus at all in what we do, but write about it in a way that someone who doesn't want to go to your church, and probably wouldn't even go if you invited them, but write in such a way that they would read it and at least find it interesting and compelling. And so, yeah, I hope what we do also points people to Jesus in a lot of ways.
Yeah, so this may already be your answer to this question, but as an ideation person, as a brainstorming person, as a person that is future-minded and idea-minded, what do you see as being the future for this part of Love Thy Nerd as far as chief content nerd? What's your plan as far as looking forward and moving on? You're doing this kind of work already, but what do you hope for?
Yeah, and so one of the things that I really like, my book it's not like an official Love Thy Nerd book, but I got the opportunity because of my work through Love Thy Nerd. And those are the kinds of things that I really would like to see more of. So we're talking right now about potentially publishing. And so this gets into April Lynn Cowet's role at Love Thy Nerd. She's our chief resource nerd. And so she really works on a lot of the curriculum things that we have, but she and I work closely on those things. So we're both editor types, there's a lot of synergy, I think, in what we do. But yeah, I'd love to see we may be publishing some Bible studies in the near future for churches to use. We may be ebooks. We've talked about a lot of ebooks, or maybe even publishing some more books that really delve into why nerd culture matters and why it can be a meaningful part of our lives. And so, yeah, those are some things that are definitely like not just like dreams or whatever, but I think like very likely to happen soon. And I just want to see more of what we're doing too, just like more educational pieces that help the church, more reflective pieces that help people see what's good and true and beautiful in nerd culture. We also want to write about the problems, honestly, if we can, some of the problems in nerd culture. This is not a space that is devoid of problems and darkness and brokenness. Just recently, there's this trend of hate raids on Twitch and Gamergate wasn't that long ago, and we're still feeling the effects of that. And toxicity and misogyny and all those things, those are still big problems in nerd culture spaces. Yeah, that's another space where I'd like us to grow. I'd also really like us to grow to be more diverse. Nerd culture, certain parts of nerd culture are predominantly, I think, male and white. And I don't think that's always because those are the types of people that just happen to like those types of things. It's because of a lot of gatekeeping, and I'd like to see that. I'd like to see that change, and I'd like for Love Thy Nerd to work at being more diverse and inclusive, so that we can be a part of encouraging that and seeing that change.
Yeah,
and it's also just not true that a lot of the things we think about in nerd culture spaces. Take video games for example, that we think that's a predominantly male space. And it really isn't. If you look at the statistics for the last decade, it's been anywhere between 40 to 46% of all gamers are female. So it's just simply not true that it's all the boys in their basements.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of those stigmas and things that we set up as these boundaries. I feel like I was watching a game theory episode not too long ago that was talking about the majority of gamers aren't even on a console. Like mobile gaming has absolutely taken over in the world by storm, just because phones are so much more accessible. And so,
and then you have some of these games that are like, mobile gamers aren't real gamers,
right?
And that's another gatekeeping thing. But
so if you gatekeep them out, then it does feel like the gaming world is so small. But once you include mobile gamers, it's even bigger than we could even imagine, and we might even be on the smaller side compared to them. Yeah, I think that's great. I think so. As far as creating the content, you guys have that, and Love Thy Nerd does that well. But what about facilitating those conversations? Is there a future for that to happen on LTN? Is it already happening, or what does that look like to you as far as those conversations once the questions are in the air? Once these topics have been addressed, what does it look like then?
Sure, yeah. I think we're definitely trying to do that with our podcasts and have more diverse guests onto them. Like I think I said before, I host this podcast called Humans of Gaming, where we interview game designers about their life and their beliefs and what makes them tick. And so that's a space that we're working towards that on. And also we have Love Thy NerdCon once a year. And so that's another space where we get to have those kinds of conversations and talk to, hopefully, a growing diversity of people who are doing nerd ministry. And then, of course, like you said, just hosting those kinds of articles too, where we're, hopefully being a more inclusive voice in those spaces. So those are some of the ways off the bat, but I think also like we just got an advisory team who is going to help advise us into the future. So almost like a board of directors, but our advisory team is there to help us pursue that. That's one of the things we've asked them to do is let's bring some people who know us and love us, but are not on staff, are not us. They're not our founders. And bring them in. And one of the goals we've given them is help us be more diverse, more inclusive. Like, we want you to speak into this so that we can grow. Because I think that's how you grow in those spaces, is you don't just start throwing stuff at the wall. I like to do that. I love to throw stuff at the wall, just see what sticks. But I think a big part, especially when it comes to diversity and inclusion, you've got to talk to people who are not like you, who are different than you. You got to talk to a diversity of voices and ask them, hey, where do we need to grow? How do we need to, what steps can we take? What do you see? Where are we weak in those spaces? And so that's happening too, which I'm excited about.
I think one of the gifts of having a really robust community like Love Thy Nerd has is that you've got the existing critical mass that you can work in these spaces and tackle these issues and explore the possibility. But another huge aspect that I'm thankful for in this work of nerd ministry is the gift of collaboration. I've written for Love Thy Nerd, And I love going to LTN Con and looking at all of the different people that you guys bring together and getting to meet those people. And we met some of them here on Nerds of Prey. And one of our big goals here on Nerds of Prey is just to highlight all these nerd ministries. So I'm curious to know, what do you think about the possibility for collaboration? How do you think we're using it, whether as LTN or whether nerd ministry in general, and how can we do better as far as working with one another and leaning on our connection as Christians, regardless of denomination or background? I'm Methodist, so we're super into the connectionalism, so that's why I might be nauseating everybody with this. But I do think our connection and our collaborative ability is what makes the internet so viable as a medium.
Yeah,
So,
for sure.
Yeah. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, and we're definitely doing some of that already. Love Thy NerdCon is an example of how that's something that we have on our calendar every year now that we're going to do that with. So like we had Mike Perna, who I think you mentioned is coming on this show, right? Or did you already have him?
He's on the episode that comes out after our interview, but before this interview airs. Yeah.
Yeah, Mike's awesome. And I met him through Game Church. I twisted his arm to write for Game Church, and Mike's a great writer and a really good speaker too. Like he came and spoke about his no preaching rule at LTN Con, about how when he does his Inroads tabletop ministry stuff, like he doesn't preach at people at the table, at the board game table. That's not the space for it, but talks about that's an opportunity to build relationships and yes, point people to Jesus, but there's a certain way that you go about it, and it's really good. Every time he speaks is really good. Hector Mirai is with Faith and Fandom, and he spoke at LTN Con as well, did a breakout session for us, and also co-hosts one of our podcasts on comic books, The Pull List. So yeah, I feel like we're already pretty connected, and it's just Jamie Harris, who does a video game ministry, spoke at LTN Con, and we're partnering with him to do a Minecraft league right now, which has been really cool. We basically people send in their build. They have a few days to build. They send in their build, and then we judge it on Twitch. And it's kind of almost like a reality show, like Lego Masters or something, but with Minecraft. It's really fun. But those are just ways we're connecting with all kinds of different nerd ministries. And yeah, I think it's just a matter of trying to keep an open hand there and figure out ways to, because we dabble in all of it. That's our thing. It's like we want to have our hand in a little bit of everything. So if we can lift up some of these other ministries, we definitely want to do that, because there's some cool people out there doing really good stuff. I will say you also have to be careful there, because there are nerd ministries out there that are like, I don't know, maybe they're not nerd ministries generally, but there are ministries out there that are painting a picture of Christianity that I'm not comfortable with. Yeah. It's like the most jarring example would be like when you go to Gen Con or something and there's Christians outside protesting about how everyone's going to hell who's in there playing games. So yeah, you got to be a little bit careful about who you're partnering with. But the people that we found to partner with in this space just keeps growing, ones that we really do love and trust, and that's exciting. So
yeah, absolutely. Using that gift of discernment and just being open to the exploration. And I will say that's one thing that I'm low-key obsessed with, Humans of Gaming, the podcast.
Oh, nice.
I rant and rave about it to everybody that I know. It's always, we put out a Nerd of Mouth, which is like a bi-weekly blog where I just catalog some things that I'm finding in nerd ministry. And
you've got those nerd puns on lockdown.
I got all the nerd puns. I got them for days. Yeah, this is only the beginning. So I always end up citing Humans of Gaming because I just think that what y'all do is so incredible. So I would love to talk more about Humans of Gaming. How did that get started? So I know you mentioned that got started back in the day, but what really was the origin of that podcast in particular?
Yeah, so it really was the Game Church. When I left Game Church, that was something I asked. I was like, I would like to take this with me if you're okay with it. And we'll call it something else. We won't call it Game Church Podcast anymore. But really, Humans of Gaming was the Game Church podcast. And the tagline was open and honest conversations about games, life, and belief. And yeah, it was under Game Church that I interviewed Ken Levine and Steve Gaynor, and from Gone Home. He did Gone Home and Tacoma. Yeah, just all kinds of amazing indie. Edmund McMillan, who made Binding of Isaac, and some really awesome AAA and indie designers and stuff. And yeah, that was all out of this harebrained idea that Richard Clark, he's the guy I told you about that I met at Christ Pop Culture. And he was the guy who was like, oh, there's another nerd that plays video games and is a follower of Jesus and writes about it. So I actually recruited him to help me with Game Church. And we did that podcast together for a few years. And yeah, it was just this harebrained idea that he and I had that was like, what if we asked these people what they believe? But we made it a setting where it's like, it's okay to disagree. So we tell our guests, we promise we're not going to correct you or preach at you. We might say, hey, this is what I believe, and contrast what I believe from what you believe, but never out of desire to be, you're an idiot. Or
right. You should believe what I believe. Yeah.
Yeah. And I love it because I think those are conversations that just don't happen much today. We live in this so deeply divided, in this very deeply divided culture. And it feels sometimes there's people we couldn't even sit on the same table with without getting into a big fight. And so I'm just like, I want to prove that wrong and prove that you can have those kind of conversations if you'll change your expectations. And that's the only way we get to be vulnerable and get to points of like real connection, is if we'll press pause on like those debates and just try to see these people as real human beings made in God's image with real dreams and values and fears and concerns. And if everyone really is made in the image of God, then everyone has inherent value and everyone has something to teach you. And I've learned as much from those podcasts as I've maybe pointed someone to Jesus or whatever. But it is cool that podcast, because of the level of conversations that we're able to have, where we do ask people, did you grow up in church and what do you believe about God? And these kind of questions that no one asks anyone else anymore, outside of the church anyway. Because we ask those kind of level of questions, there's some people in there that I hang out with every time I go to a convention, or I sent my book off to some of them, and just because we developed this friendship, and said, hey, would you look at this? And if it's decent, would you consider writing an endorsement? And got some of these amazing, like, really kind endorsements from folks that I'm like, I never would have thought that would happen, because I would never think they would come to my church if I invited them. It's that kind of thing. So yeah, that podcast has been like just a huge blessing to me. So it's cool to hear that there are some people out there who actually listen to it.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, no, I make sure not to miss one. It really is just interesting to hear the perspectives, like you said. And I'm curious, you mentioned that you've learned so much yourself in coming to that place in kind of a humble spirit and listening and being present in that space. You've taken away a lot. So if you had to sum up one big takeaway or one big surprise that you found just by listening to people, what would you say is that one thing that you've taken away?
I think that podcast and having those conversations has really helped me to have more empathy for people who feel hurt by the church, because I would say like at least 75% or so of those who are atheist or agnostic or whatever on that show grew up in the church on some level and were there and had these questions or had experiences that just made them go like, I can't be here anymore. And I think like growing up in church, you'd have conversations about those kinds of people that demonize them. It's, oh, they left because they're addicted to some sin, or they left because, I don't know, Satan got a hold of their heart or something. But we would say all those things without ever having talked to people about their actual experience. So yeah, it's given me a lot more empathy for people who have been hurt by the church, I think. And also like the passion to change that culture too, because just think of how much healthier our churches might be if, when people asked really hard questions, our answer was like, oh yeah, man, that's tough. That is a really tough question. I don't know, but you're welcome here. Even if we don't answer this question in a week or a month or a year, like, we want you here. I love your question, and I love you. I don't know. I'm still figuring out what that looks like. I have a lot to learn there, but I want to be a catalyst for helping the church be kinder, I guess.
I think that's why I'm so drawn to that podcast in particular, is that you do enter into that approach with a real heart of humility and listening. And rather than worrying about what am I going to say next, you're just empathizing and hearing what needs to be said. And so it's amazing.
Yeah, it's amazing the kind of conversation you can have if you'll like put that on pause like that. And in fact, early on in the Game Church podcast, I think I struggled with that, because like I've just been trained for years to that like apologetic mindset. Like I've got to know the thing that's going to show them why they're wrong and I'm right. And you just don't have to.
Yeah.
That's just not how relationships work. And yeah, I want to get to the next level with people where we are talking about why Jesus is Lord and he has risen from the dead and those kinds of things. But you don't have to do that in your first meeting.
Right.
Most of the time you probably shouldn't.
Yeah, I think that's great. I think it's important stuff, and I really do. I highly recommend it. I'll encourage everybody again. I know that I've mentioned it enough, but I do recommend that podcast highly. So I don't want time to run out on us and us not get to talk about this book. So I want to talk about your book, Know Thy Gamer. I'm excited for this kind of thing. So I wanted to give you just a quick time to talk about what is the book for? Why is the book happening? Why is this important? I'm also a parent, and so I appreciate the parenting guide as this platform.
How old is you have one child?
Yeah, one kid, 2.5 years old.
Okay.
She's our little girl, and we actually have another one on the way coming in April. So we'll be a parent of two. and we'll see how life changes. I've heard the jump from 1 to 2 is a mess.
Yeah, I think it was worse for us. The jump was worse from 2 to 3. But yeah, in a few years, maybe 3, maybe 4, it could be 5 years for you, you'll probably have this experience where even though you're a nerd and a gamer and stuff, like it's going to drive you nuts that your kids are as into gaming as they are. Because you love them and want them to be diverse and have a diversity of interests. And yeah, right now we're in the space where my 10-year-old daughter, if she could, she would spend all of her time playing Roblox. And I'm a gamer, so I see the value in Roblox. I see the value in video games, but I don't want that to be the only thing she cares about. I want her to love people. I want her to love her sister. I want her to love her little brother. I want her to be kind. I want her to do, service projects and all kinds of things. Yeah, there's a lot of parents pulling their hair out about how much their kids are into video games, and there's a lot of conflict in homes. So that's a big part of the book, is trying to help parents who don't get why their kids are so into gaming understand it. There's a lot of parents that just don't understand gaming at all, so that's a big part of it too. Let's understand it, let's unpack it, let's see what's good and true and beautiful in it. Let's also unpack what can be broken in it too. So the first chapter is like, it's called Games Are Good. And so the goal of that chapter is to illustrate there's so much potential in video games to enhance our lives, to help us love our neighbors, to build community, to have these epic victories. Games can help us feel better about ourselves, and I think that can be good. I don't want to feel bad about myself, but that's one of those things that Christians have a hard time accepting, that it's okay to play games as a means of increasing your self-esteem. That can be a positive. But anyway, so that's the first chapter. And then the second chapter, and I develop a theological framework for that too. Like, here's what I think God thinks about games. Games are in the Bible. There's mention of play in the Bible, which is the father of games, or the catalyst for games. Play existed, then games, right? And then the second chapter it's called Games Are Broken. And so that's where we get into the most problematic aspects of video games. So we get into, try to answer all the big questions about video game violence. Addiction is the big concern of parents these days. There's a lot of parents that think their kids are addicted. So we unpack a lot of research, a lot of statistics, and try to help parents get some grasp on that. And then also the other problems like sexism and misogyny and toxicity. And so the goal of that chapter is to sort of just help parents understand where we're at on those topics. And then the next chapter is called Games Are Complicated. So that's where I lay some groundwork for just, hey, here's some tips and tricks essentially on how to navigate this space as a follower of Jesus, as a parent, in a way that will promote your child, loving your child. Like, that's the goal of a parent. God hasn't called us to fix our children. They're not broken. He's called us to love them. I know there's a sense in which we're all broken by sin or whatever, but your job as a parent is not to fix your children, it's to love them. And that's where we unpack some tips and tricks on screen time and all kinds of things, but also with just this framework of prioritizing the love of your kid. And then the final chapter is Games Are Mission. And that chapter tells the story of Love Thy Nerd, really, and helps parents see that, hey, if you have a really nerdy kid who's super into video games, yes, you need to set some limits and you need to help them diversify their interests. But that's also an opportunity for mission. Just like a lot of churches do sports missions or whatever, or all kinds of like hobby-based mission kind of stuff, why not help our kids dream about how they might do nerd missions and use their love of gaming to reach people and point people to Jesus.
Yeah, I think we're paving the way with a lot of the things that we're doing. As one stigma disappears, the idea that games are bad, or the idea that the satanic panic kind of stuff, and now we've moved on, we've accepted gaming as a thing, and we're starting to come up with the new problems behind it. And I think it's important for works like this to pave the way. So between now and July, that's a little while. It's a little bit of time. So what would you say, like right now, if somebody is a parent stressing out about this in the moment, other than going ahead and pre-ordering your book that I'm sure will be down in the description down below, what can they do in the meantime? Are there any resources or anything you would point them to?
Sure. Yeah, there's two that I really like. My friend Andy Robertson wrote a book called Taming Gaming. If you just go to taminggaming.com, you'll find it. It probably does way more research than I even did for my book. He's very thoughtful in his approach, and it's not necessarily aimed at Christians, but he is a follower of Jesus, so that's nice to know for some people. But it's trying to help games be less of a problem in your home. And it's not just for kids. Like, some of this, and I get into this in my book, some of it is that parents, you just need to chill out and realize you're not going to fix your kid tomorrow.
Right.
And again, it's not even the goal. of parenting is to fix them. So sometimes a lot of the problems that happen in the home around gaming are parent problems. Can I say that to myself as a parent who's broken like the rules or like the guidelines that I would set for myself as a parent? I've lost my temper and I've parented in ways that I'm not proud of. So I need to work on me first, then I can help work on my kids. And Taming Gaming would be a really great resource there. Then the other one I really like, and this is also not a Christian resource, but I think it's just very helpful for educational purposes, is Common Sense Media. It's just a great website that's very descriptive. You get reviews written by professional game and whatever, TV, movies, all of it, by professional critics that are very good writers. But then there's also parent reviews where parents review those things. And you get to see a parent's perspective on different things. And then they have all sorts of other resources too about things like addiction and violence and all those kinds of things. Those would be two really helpful resources. And of course, lovethynerd.com, we've got some great parenting articles there as well. So I'll give you an example. A few years ago, and it still is, but a few years ago, Fortnite was like the craze, right? Sure. Everyone was playing Fortnite, and half the parents of those kids who were playing Fortnite were fed up with their kids playing it. So we wrote an article called 8 Better Games for Kids Than Fortnite. It's not that we don't like Fortnite, but the reward structures of that game, I think, are not super great. And so we tried to give some other ideas of games parents could put in front of their kids that have a healthier reward structure that doesn't reward compulsive play. Yeah.
Awesome. Super cool. So I think that's great. So definitely recommend that, and I'll pre-order that and anticipate it as we move into the future of what it looks like to be a gaming parent or a parent that has kids that game. So now I want to turn future forward, and like you mentioned earlier, you are very much an ideation person, so maybe you have a real vision for this beyond Love Thy Nerd, beyond any of the structures that are currently existing. What do you think this intersection looks like in 5-10 years? The way I've been putting it is, if you could dream a dream of where nerd ministry is in the next 10 years, what does it look like? What does the future of this nerd ministry look like?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's going to be they're going to be way bigger, because the church is in this space right now where I think it's being forced to recognize that this is like a big part of the world we live in. And so I think the church is waking up, when I say church, I'm universal. Sure. Church, is waking up to this being a really important and viable ministry space. So I think it's just going to be a bigger deal. I think you're going to see more churches embracing it. I also think we may see some legitimately viable virtual iterations of the church. There's already some of that going on. I know some guys that help out with VR Church, and I'm not sure, I'll be honest, I'm not sure how I feel about it.
Yeah.
I want to be in the same room with people, going up to the front, taking communion together, like those types of things, like that embodiment. An embodied community is important to me, and I think even maybe important in my understanding of the gospel and stuff. But man, it's cool. It's really cool what they're trying to do, and it makes me uncomfortable, but I think that's probably good. We don't grow unless we make ourselves a little bit uncomfortable. Right. So praise God for those VR Church guys. I don't know, it's cool. We
got to wrestle with those weird conflicts and see what name we come out with on the other end.
And so, and if any of them listen to this, I'm sure they've wrestled with this already. I know they're not dumb. They've thought through these things. Yeah. You should have one of them on if you haven't.
Oh, for sure. I'd love to reach out to them and learn more. I wrote my, that's not really a dissertation in seminary, but I wrote my kind of final thesis on the virtual church and VR church, and looking back to whenever it first really started in Second Life. And Second Life feels like ages ago. No. And that's where we were even doing it back then and exploring the possibility there. And I'm intrigued by the future there as well. And I feel totally overwhelmed and unprepared to do anything in that space. So I'm thankful there are people out there paving the way there and exploring that for us. Yeah, I think that's very much true. So as we wrap up and ask this final question, I like to always get recommendations from the people. What are you currently experiencing? And I know you mentioned you got 3 kids and very little time, but hopefully you're making a little bit of time here and there even to experience little chunks. What are you currently watching? What are you currently playing? And what are you currently reading? And I can start us off with what you think. So I just finished up. It's spooky season as we're recording this, and so I've just finished up watching pretty much all of Mike Flanagan's filmography, because I started watching Midnight Mass and I was obsessed. Yeah. I ate it up in a single night, and I was like, well, I guess now I got to go experience everything this guy's ever made. And so I hyper focused on him, and now I've watched The Haunting of Hill House, and I'm gonna go watch The Haunting of Bly Manor, and just totally wreck my sleep schedule for the next couple weeks. And I'm currently just finished up playing Go ahead.
Does it keep you up if you watch those?
Yeah, I
Like, you
can't
won't
watch them in the
sleep?
dark. I cannot watch them in the dark.
Yeah.
I'll have to watch them during the daytime and just hope that I don't remember them. But it's like
Yeah.
always, as soon as you close your eyes and you're like, all right, I'm ready to go to bed now, then it's like all the images just rush into your head. And
Oh boy.
fortunately, like most of Mike Flanagan's stuff isn't too jump scary. And so there's not so much that. It's just like really good character studies. And so I'm loving it. Absolutely eating up every
Yeah.
minute.
Nice.
Then playing Metroid Dread. I
Dread.
just finished that and just started up Disco Elysium because it finally came out for the Switch. And so I'm super
Oh, that's on
excited.
my list. Yeah.
I'm super excited. So far, I was not prepared. It is cheeky as can be. I was not
Yeah.
expecting it to be like hilarious.
Yeah.
Like it's gonna make me laugh out loud, which
It's
normally
hilarious
I don't.
and also like it's pretty dark.
Yeah.
Like from a like psychological standpoint.
Yeah.
It's interesting.
I'm
for sure.
excited to discover all the different nuances, and I know that it goes with that like OG fable. Like you get to choose whether to be good or bad, and your character shifts and adapts compared to that. So
Yep.
I'm excited.
Yeah, that's cool.
And then as far as reading, I'm currently reading completely on the other end of the spectrum. So we've got like scary game, psychological game, scary psychological horror shows, and I'm reading Fly Me to the Moon, which is a romance manga, which
Oh,
is
nice.
as slice of life romance as you can get. And I have no
Yeah.
idea why I'm reading this. It is, I don't even know. I'm reading it just because it's like my guilty pleasure right now. It's just this story about this newlywed couple that have barely even met, but he gets saved by her one night whenever a bus almost hits him, and he like gets pushed out of the way, and he vows that night, I'm going to marry you. And she's, are you sure? And he's, yes, I'm sure I'm going to marry you someday. And then she disappears. And then 8 years later shows up on his doorstep and is, you said you were going to marry me, so let's get married. And then they do. And so they don't know each other, and they're married,
that's a
and they just
mistake,
have
I feel
all
like.
of these. You'd think it'd be a mistake and that there'd be trouble in paradise, but they're both so adorably awkward the entire time that it's just, I don't even know.
What's it called again?
It's called Fly Me to the Moon.
Okay,
It
that
also
sounds
has an
great.
anime called Over the Moon with You, and I don't know
Okay.
the actual like Japanese title, but it's so
That sounds
like
amazing.
it's so light and easy, and compared to the other heavy things that I'm watching and playing, it's just
You need
really
some of that
just a
sometimes,
pleasant
I feel like.
read.
Yeah, yeah. To answer your question, I'm really into, and I'll give a disclaimer about this because it's very violent. So if you're averse to violence, maybe skip it. But the Fargo TV show series, the TV series, I just finished season 3. Yeah, what I love about it is the characters are so quirky and complicated. And also, I think it's one of the rare shows that always has at least one or two really good characters that are virtuous, like very virtuous characters. So the foils in that there's usually one villain who's horrifically evil, and there's another character who's in the middle and sort of stumbles into crime. So there's this great like formula where there's a virtuous detective or someone in law enforcement. There's a really evil criminal. Then there's someone who stumbles into criminality, and they all intersect, and it's this gloriously complex series of mistakes. And by the one who stumbles into crime, and then just all these great Midwestern accents and wonderful
Now, is
characters.
it like True Detective in the sense that it's like a season-long anthology where each season is its own capsule?
Yeah. Each season's kind of self-contained, but there is some like little connections.
Sure.
But it's all set in Minnesota or South Dakota, so it all has that. But they're different eras too. Like every season, a different time frame. So I like that a lot. My wife and I are big Survivor fans, the reality TV show.
Sure.
We actually have our own podcast. We just started it a year ago. It was during COVID. We started it when the season 40 started. So it's called Jen and Drew Talk Survivor. And people laugh at me because they're like, you still watch Survivor? But we love it because there's a connection to what I do. I love it because I think it's a great game. Like, I love the game aspects of it. It's a very complex social deduction game. But it also has physical elements and that is physically demanding. And so the tagline is outwit, outlast, outplay. And so it's fun. It's really fun. We get into the strategy of it, talk about who's playing well, who's not, and all the different dynamics, the mechanics of the game. It's really fun.
Now, you don't make it to season 40 without having pretty good catch.
Yeah,
Pretty good
yeah.
hook.
I think they have a great formula I think it's the best game on television. That's what I always say. It's the best game you can watch on television. I'd rather watch people play the game of Survivor than professional football or whatever. And then I haven't had much time for gaming lately. Most of the time I play games with my kids, but I have gotten into Dirt, the racing game,
Yeah.
the rally racing game. I've been playing Dirt Rally 2.0, And I'm a big fan of the Souls games, like Dark Souls and
Sure.
Bloodborne and stuff. What drew me to this is I heard that Dirt Rally is like the Dark Souls of racing. It's super demanding, like very requires precision, timing, and you just have to be like dialed in to play it well. And you don't get restarts. But you get 5 restarts over the course of like a whole series of races. You can do 5 restarts. And if you mess up your car. And it has pretty realistic like damage and stuff to your car, so you can, if you trash your car in one of these like insane mountain rally courses, like you're gonna have to drive that same car in the next stage. You get to repair it every few stages, but it's just, yeah, I like those type of games that require like flow. I don't know if you know what I mean by that,
Oh,
but
yeah.
like just totally
Get you
dialed
the
in,
zone.
and yeah. So that's been fun. And then we've been reading this book called Simplicity Parenting, which is just about like simplifying everything in your kids' lives. So I've been reading a lot of parenting books because I'm writing one.
Sure.
But if you want a book about like cutting back some of the excesses, is that a word? The excess stuff in parenting in American parents, I think it would be helpful to you. It's a little Luddite-ish, but I like to read things that are from a different perspective than me anyway. And
Well, it's
then
kind of like I never want to actually do the van life, the hashtag van life thing, but I really like watching videos of hashtag van life.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah.
learning from the minimalist lifestyle while not
Yeah.
necessarily going in whole hog.
Yeah,
So-
yeah. There's a lot to learn from that, like the whole Marie Kondo craze.
Right.
I found that helpful. I watched some of that her stuff and cleaned out a bunch of stuff I don't use anymore and got rid of it. It feels good.
Right. Yeah, it's a spectrum. You don't necessarily have
Yeah.
to simplify everything. You can just
You don't
can
have to buy in completely.
work towards
Yeah.
it. Yeah.
Yeah. And I'll mention an anime that I really like that is on Netflix, actually. It's called March Comes Like a Lion. That's a slice of life anime about a professional shogi player in Japan, and just really endearing characters. So that's been my kind of thing. You mentioned just something that feels good and doesn't,
Yeah.
it's not super heavy. There's some heavy like background of the characters, but it's mostly just this group of people that find themselves in the same space and are trying to do their best to love each other and support each other. It's nice.
Yeah, I always see that one recommended to me because I watched Your Lie in April, which is like one of my favorite
Yeah.
anime of all time. And I bawled through all of Your Lie in April. So I don't know.
Oh, man.
I don't know if I can handle any more emotional anime. So if it's anything like that's where I gotta choose a specific time and season
It's-
where I'm like I
I
can
think
handle
it's probably
crying today.
Yeah, I think it's probably goofier. It's a bit
little
goofier
goofier,
than that and a little more lighthearted. So I think
Yeah.
you'd probably like it.
Yeah, I'll have to check that out for sure. I appreciate all the recommendations and all the good stuff. It's so interesting to me how everybody just has so many different things that they experience and so many different games and things they like. That's what I really love about this place is that we have a lot of different ways we can go, a lot of things we can watch, a lot of things we can play, a lot of things we can read.
Yep.
In closing, go ahead and give a quick shout out. So where can people find you? All the different avenues. I'll tag most of the stuff down in the description down below, but just what highlights would you have? Any social media
Yeah.
or projects or thing you're working on?
Yeah, you can definitely follow most everything I'm doing on Twitter now. Because of this book, I've been making an honest effort. It's like one of those things you learn you have to do when you write a book, I guess. And like now I actually have to use my Twitter
Right.
because I want people to read this thing because I've worked hard on it. So I am making an effort to be really active on Twitter if I can. I say really active, somewhat active probably is the more accurate.
Nobody's on
answer.
Twitter because they want to be on Twitter.
That's
It's purely a
exactly
burden.
right. Yeah. So Drew Dixon 82 on Twitter, and then lovethynerd.com, Love Thy Nerd Community on Facebook. If you search for Love Thy Nerd Community on Facebook, you can also like us on Facebook as well. We have our official account, and then we have a community on Facebook. We have a Discord channel as well, which is a great place to connect with other nerds. And yeah, just any of the socials, search for Love Thy Nerd. Yeah, and that would be a good way to keep up with what I'm.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I'll plug the podcast and make sure that people know about that and keep up with anything there. I don't think you don't stream on Twitch with any of the nights, do you?
I don't. I've thought about getting into it, but right now I'm not. We have a stream. Yeah, that's another great place to go if you want to check out what Love Thy Nerd's doing. We stream almost every night, and just go to twitch.com/lovethy-nerd and you'll find us.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you so much for coming on the show and for all this great knowledge. And hopefully people will check out all the things that you're doing. But I appreciate your time and appreciate you being here.
Yeah.
Thanks for being on the show. We'll have to have you back on sometime to just deep dive again and see what anime you're on then.
Yeah, that'd be great.
All right, that is a wrap on the latest episode of Nerds of Prey, folks. I really hope that you enjoyed the podcast. This show is distributed free of charge and worldwide. We would love your help and support by giving us a 5-star review and making sure to share this episode around to your friends so that we can reach as many nerds, geeks, and gamers as possible. Be sure to go and follow our special guest, Drew Dixon, using all the links in the show notes. Give him some kind words of encouragement for doing the great stuff that Love Thy Nerd and Drew are both doing in their careers and their callings and ministries. If you enjoyed this discussion and want to talk more, feel free to join the Checkpoint Church Discord, where we have a channel specifically for the Nerds of Prey. We're talking about all these kind of exciting things that Drew brought to the table. And for future guests, I'll actually post whenever I'm sitting down with them, and you can ask questions yourself. Not to mention, this episode did premiere on our Twitch channel live, so be sure to follow twitch.tv/checkpointchurch to catch the next episode and discuss it live with us in the chat. Our next episode is going to be dropping next month and will feature Jate Earhart of Jate Live and the Love Clan. Look forward to that, and thanks again for giving us a listen. If you have recommendations or would like to be considered as a future guest on the podcast, submit your name and biography to checkpointchurch@gmail.com. Nerds of Prey is recorded, edited, produced, and distributed by Nathan Webb and Checkpoint Church. The Checkpoint Church podcast is the hub for all of our podcast sermons and special projects. To learn more, go to checkpointchurch.com or send questions to checkpointchurch@gmail.com. Remember that we believe these things to be true about every single one of you listening, regardless of where you might be with God. We firmly believe that God loves you, we love you, and you matter. That's all for this one. I have been Nerd Pastor Nate. This has been the Nerds of Prey. Special thanks to our guest again, Drew Dixon. Until next time, folks. Bye-bye!